What if I'm carrying patterns that keep recreating the same pain? That is not self-blame, that is self-awareness. There's a big difference between saying everything is my fault and saying I need to understand the role I play in what keeps repeating. The second one is where growth begins. And yes, sometimes what we call bad luck in relationships, family drama, or always attracting the wrong people is actually a familiar emotional pattern that started long before we noticed it. Often in childhood, family systems, or survival habits we learn growing up. Sometimes we don't repeat what was done to us exactly. Sometimes we repeat the feeling. For example, chaos feels familiar, so calm feels boring. Criticism feels normal, so kindness feels suspicious. Overgiving feels like love. Fixing people feels like purpose. Being needed feels safer than being known. Walking on eggshells feels like home. Those are often generational imprints. The question becomes, what keeps repeating? Here are some questions worth sitting with. What keeps happening over and over? Do I keep ending up in the same kind of relationship? Do I always feel unseen, used, abandoned, or betrayed? Do I keep choosing people who need rescuing? Do I keep avoiding people who are actually stable? Do I always become the giver, fixer, or peacemaker? The repetition is the clue. What role do I keep playing? This part is powerful. Ask yourself, am I always the one over-explaining? Am I always the one apologizing? Am I always trying to prove my worth? Do I shut down instead of speaking up? Do I chase people who pull away? Do I leave before I can be left? Patterns often live in the role we take. What emotion feels most familiar? Sometimes our nervous system confuses familiarity with safety. Ask yourself, why does peace make me restless? Why do I trust inconsistency more than consistency? Why do I feel most alive in conflict? Why do I only feel valuable when I'm needed? That can reveal wounds passed down through generations. What did love look like growing up? This is a huge one. Was love conditional? Was affection tied to performance? Did you have to be good to receive care? Was there emotional neglect, criticism, instability, silence, addiction, or control? Were feelings ignored? Very often, adult patterns are childhood coping strategies in grown-up clothes. For example, if you learn that your needs upset people, you may become someone who never asked for anything. If you learn love was unpredictable, you may cling harder when people pull away. That's not because something is wrong with you. It's because your mind and body learned how to survive. Removing yourself from a toxic person doesn't mean you healed. Distance can protect you, but healing is what changes what you choose next. Healing shows up when you notice the pattern sooner, you pause before reacting, you stop romanticizing pain, you stop calling anxiety chemistry, you stop abandoning yourself to keep someone else. Sometimes counseling helps people identify the wound, but healing also requires practice in real life. New boundaries, new choices, new self-talk, new tolerance for peace. The sign that it may be your work to do is when different people keep leading to the same emotional outcome. Different face, same pain. Different story, same ending. That usually means there's a deeper pattern asking to be seen. This ain't it. That point is usually the beginning of real change. It's time for spiritual self-examination and psychological self-awareness in a way that a lot of people never stop to do. Conditions like bipolar disorder, anxiety, depression, and schizophrenia are mental health conditions, not moral failings. And traits like narcissistic or sociopathic behavior exist on a spectrum. from learned defense mechanisms and harmful behavior patterns to formal diagnosis that only a qualified clinician can make. That distinction matters because self-awareness isn't about labeling ourselves as bad or dark. It's about asking, what is driving my behavior? Is it fear, trauma, untreated illness, ego, shame, learned survival, or a genuine lack of empathy? That's where the real work begins, the mental health side. People living with anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, or psychotic disorders are also in relationships, raising children, dating, and trying to be and be loved, and trying to love. Following a treatment plan matters. For many mental health conditions, consistent treatment, medication when prescribed, therapy, and honest communication with healthcare providers can significantly improve stability and relationship functioning. Treatment adherence is strongly linked with better outcomes in conditions like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Some self-awareness questions from this standpoint are: am I taking my medication as prescribed? Do I notice changes in my mood, sleep, energy, or thoughts? Am I expecting my partner to carry what should be handled in treatment? Do I become someone different when symptoms flare? Am I aware of how my illness affects communication and trust? For example, anxiety may show up as overthinking, needing reassurance, fear of abandonment. Depression may look like withdrawal, slow motivation, emotional numbness. Bipolar disorder may affect impulsivity, spending, irritability, or intense emotional shifts. Psychosis-related symptoms can distort perception and make trust difficult. These are health issues that need care, not shame. The most self-aware thing a person can do is say, I need support and I need to stay committed to my healing. The spiritual, religious side, are we living what we say we believe? That's a spiritual mirror. A person can speak scripture beautifully and still operate from ego, control, fear, pride, or manipulation. Self-awareness from a faith standpoint asks, am I using faith to heal or to hide? Do I use scripture to control people? Do I use forgiveness as an excuse to avoid boundaries? Am I acting from love or from pride? Is my relationship with God personal or only cultural? Am I performing righteousness instead of practicing it? Sometimes religion can be used as a mask. For example, staying in harmful cycles because God hates divorce, excusing repeated betrayal because everyone sins, demanding submission while ignoring compassion, quoting scripture instead of doing inner work. That's not spiritual maturity. That's using faith language to avoid accountability. Real spiritual self-awareness asks whether your beliefs are changing how you love, speak, forgive, and set boundaries, where both meet. Honestly, these two standpoints meet in one place: responsibility. Whether it's spiritual growth or mental health healing, the question is, am I taking responsibility for my impact on others and on myself? That means honoring medical care, staying honest about symptoms, not weaponizing religion, examining ego, choosing growth over repetition. Not just pray about it, not just take the meds, but do both the inner and outer work. A lot of people don't resist growth because they don't want peace. They resist it because growth often asks them to face something painful about themselves: shame, fear, grief, pride, or an old wound. So instead of looking inward, the mind looks for a way out. Finding fault in the messenger instead of sitting with the message is one of the most common blocks. In psychology, that can overlap with defensiveness or projection. Here are some other ways people unintentionally block self-awareness. Defensiveness and instant self-justification. Instead of pausing to ask, is there any truth in this? The mind immediately says, that's not me, You do it too. You just don't understand. That's because of what they did. Sometimes the explanation may even be partly true, but it still blocks reflection. The growth question is, am I explaining myself to understand or to avoid accountability? Blaming patterns. This is the same story, different people cycle. Examples. Every ex was crazy. Every friend was jealous. Every boss was out to get me. Now, sometimes people really do experience repeated mistreatment. But if the same conflict follows them into every relationship, friendship, workspace, or family dynamic, it may be worth asking what role they're playing. A useful question: what part of this pattern keeps showing up around me? Projection. This is when someone sees in others what they don't want to face in themselves. For example, a controlling person accuses everyone else of control. Someone dishonest becomes hyper-focused on others' dishonesty. Someone emotionally unavailable complains everyone else is distant. Sometimes what bothers us most in others points to something unresolved within us. Victim identity becoming permanent. Pain is real, and many people have truly been hurt. But sometimes someone can become so identified with being the wounded one that they stop seeing their own choices. It shifts from I was hurt to I am only the hurt person. That can keep a person stuck in old stories instead of moving into healing and agency. Using labels as shields. This can happen spiritually, emotionally, or clinically. Examples: that's just how I am. I'm an Aries, that's why. It's my anxiety. God knows my heart. I'm just blunt. A reason is not always an excuse. Self-awareness asks, am I using this explanation to understand myself or to avoid changing? Ego and pride. Sometimes growth is blocked because admitting fault feels like humiliation. For some people, being wrong feels unsafe. So instead of saying, I need to work on that, they protect the ego with pride, silence, anger, or superiority. The ego often says, if I admit this, I lose power. But real strength is the ability to be honest. Constant distraction. People can outrun self-awareness by staying busy. Work, social media, dating, drama, overhelping others, religion without reflection, substances, or constant noise can all keep a person from hearing themselves. Sometimes silence is where truth finally shows up. Repeating what feels familiar. Sometimes people don't grow because familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar peace. They go back to chaos, toxic partners, emotionally unavailable people, over-functioning roles, family patterns. Because it feels known, the nervous system often chooses familiar over healthy. Taking feedback as an attack. Instead of hearing, this behavior is hurting people, they hear, I am a bad person. That shame response can make people shut down, lash out, or attack the source. Sometimes the work is learning to separate my behavior from my worth. A behavior can need changing without the person being worthless. Spiritual bypassing. This is when someone uses spiritual language to avoid emotional work. Examples: I gave it to God instead of dealing with it. I forgave them, but never set boundaries. Quoting scripture instead of addressing harmful behavior. Faith can support healing, but it shouldn't replace honest examination. Honestly, one of the biggest signs that growth is being blocked is when a person feels triggered and immediately turns outward. A powerful pause is, sometimes the trigger itself is the doorway to self-awareness. I don't think everyone from every background is suffering from hookup culture in the same way. That would flatten a lot of different life experiences, values, ages, and communities. But I do think a lot of people are blending unhealed patterns, casual dating norms, and generational wounds together, and then only naming it later when it turns painful. That's a very real thing. Research does show that casual, uncommitted sexual encounters have become more socially normalized, especially among younger adults, and that dating for traditional courtship has decreased in some settings. At the same time, the real issue often isn't hookup culture by itself. Sometimes hookup culture becomes the container that holds deeper issues: fear of intimacy, fear of commitment, avoidance of vulnerability, unresolved trauma, generational relationship models, poor boundaries, lack of communication. So later, when the situation crashes, people may call it toxic, drama, narcissistic, emotionally unavailable, love bombing. Sometimes those labels fit. Sometimes they're being used after the fact to explain a dynamic that started without clarity from the beginning. If two people enter something from the jump that is vague, casual, undefined, and emotionally disconnected, then later one person wants more, the other doesn't, and now suddenly someone is called toxic. It's worth asking, was it truly toxicity, or was it misalignment and unspoken expectations from the start? That distinction matters. For example, sometimes what people call toxic is really one person wanted emotional closeness, the other wanted casual connection. Neither communicated clearly, both projected assumptions. That creates pain, but pain is not always pathology. I also think social media has added a layer where people now self-diagnose partners very quickly. Words like narcissistic, sociopath, avoidant, bipolar, trauma bonded get used in everyday conversation, sometimes accurately, but often as shorthand for "this person hurt me." That can block deeper reflection, because sometimes the better question is, why did I stay in something that was never aligned with what I truly wanted? That brings it back to self-awareness. At the same time, hookup culture itself is not automatically unhealthy. For some people, casual dating is consensual, honest, and emotionally clear. Research and even community discussions suggest the emotional outcome often depends less on the act itself and more on the motivation, honesty, and expectations involved. The harm often comes when someone hopes casual will become serious, someone uses sex to avoid loneliness, someone mistakes chemistry for compatibility, someone suppresses their real needs to seem cool. That's where generational patterns can blend in. For instance, being taught love must be earned, being taught to accept crumbs, being taught that chaos equals passion, being taught that sex creates obligation. Those old beliefs can absolutely get folded into modern dating. Sometimes it's less hookup culture, ruined dating, and more old wounds found a new vehicle. That's why two people can participate in the same dating culture and have completely different outcomes. One walks away fine, another walks away traumatized or re traumatized. The culture is part of it, the inner pattern is the rest. Sometimes people name the pain only after the relationship ends, instead of recognizing from the beginning that the foundation was never healthy.